On November 19, 1944, in a makeshift field workshop outside Metz, France, a battle-scarred M4 Sherman tank sat beneath a tattered canvas lean-to. Its turret bore a shell hole, its wiring was fried, and its 75mm gun hung askew like a broken limb. The tank's crew had been told what every tanker dreads to hear: "She's finished." But sometime past midnight, when the storm had driven every other mechanic to shelter, one young corporal stayed behind, determined to save something the senior mechanics had written off as scrap. Hours later, when dawn broke over the muddy encampment, that Sherman could do something no one had thought possible. Something that would make German Panzer commanders question their own eyes and send American officers scrambling for explanations. For decades, the U.S. Army called it an anomaly. Veterans whispered about it in fragments. German intelligence reports dismissed it as American propaganda. But inside a forgotten folder in the National Archives, a single memorandum written in shaky handwriting told a different story. It wasn't an upgrade. It was his mistake, and we erased it. What happened in that rain-lashed workshop wasn't an approved repair, wasn't a planned modification, and certainly wasn't in any Army technical manual. It was an error, a miscalculation made in darkness that transformed an ordinary Sherman into a long-range precision weapon capable of hitting targets at distances that even elite German Panther crews believed impossible for American gunners. How could one exhausted mechanics, fumbling in the dark, outperform the Army's best engineers? How did a tank that should have been scrapped suddenly pick off enemy armor at nearly 2,000 yards? Shots that defied every tactical doctrine? And why did the military brass, when they finally discovered the truth, choose to destroy the miracle and bury the man who created it? The answer to those questions lay hidden for decades, waiting in a grease-stained archive note until someone finally understood what had been lost that night in France. Before we dive into this story, subscribe and leave a comment telling me where you're watching from. Now, relax, grab your coffee, and enjoy this beautiful story. Tell me in the comments where you're watching from, and hit subscribe so you don't miss more real history like this. On November 19th, 1944, the rain fell in torrents across the American lines outside Metz. The ground had turned into a treacherous soup of mud that swallowed equipment and tested every soldier's endurance. The field workshop, little more than a stretched canvas roof anchored to bent poles, offered scant protection from the downpour. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of wet canvas, diesel fuel, and scorched metal, a stench that had become as familiar as the sound of distant artillery. The Sherman tank designated Lucky Lady was dragged into the workshop just after nightfall, and the damage assessment was immediate and brutal. The chief mechanic, a grizzled sergeant with 3 years of tank repair under his belt, took one look at the shell-punched turret, the mangled wiring, and the visibly misaligned main gun and shook his head. "Forget it," he said flatly. "This one's done. Strip what we can salvage and get these boys a replacement." But Staff Sergeant William Grady, Lucky Lady's commander, wasn't ready to accept that verdict. Grady was a broad-shouldered man in his early 30s, with the kind of exhausted eyes that had witnessed too many friends become casualties in burning steel coffins. Beside him stood Corporal Tom Barlow, the gunner, younger, quieter, carrying the particular frustration of a marksman whose skill was constantly betrayed by his weapon's limitations. The rest of the crew, driver, loader, assistant driver, stood in anxious silence, faces smudged with soot and hope. "We don't have another tank," Grady said, his voice measured but firm. "Every Sherman in this sector is already spoken for. Half the company's been knocked out in the last week alone." The chief mechanic sighed, scanning his depleted roster of mechanics. Most were overworked, underfed, and operating on fumes. Finally, his eyes landed on a slight figure working quietly at the back of the tent. "Hartfield," he called out, "you're on gun repair." Corporal Samuel "Sammy" Hartfield looked up, rain-soaked and startled. At 22, he was the kind of mechanic no one really noticed. Competent with engines, reliable with track repairs, but notoriously clumsy with the precision work that gun calibration demanded. He had never aligned a Sherman's main gun before. Everyone in the workshop knew it. But no one else was available, and no one else was willing to work through the night on a tank they'd already condemned. That night, as the camp settled into an uneasy sleep punctuated by thunder and the distant rumble of artillery, Sammy Hartfield stood alone beside Lucky Lady. A single lantern flickered beside him, casting wild shadows across the damaged turret. Rain hammered relentlessly against the canvas overhead, and wind shook the tent walls until they snapped and billowed like sails. But Hartfield worked on, his hands slick with grease and rainwater, muttering instructions to himself from a dog-eared technical manual he could barely read in the dim light. The gun mount required absolute precision. Calibrated bolts, exact measurements, springs tensioned to specifications, measured in fractions of millimeters. The recoil system had to be rebuilt, the stabilizer brackets realigned, and the entire assembly tested against factory standards. But as midnight crept toward dawn, Hartfield's measuring tools, already bent from previous repairs, became increasingly unreliable. The lantern sputtered, casting deceptive shadows across the ruler marks he desperately tried to follow. And then, in a gust of wind that nearly extinguished his light entirely, something went wrong. Or perhaps, in the most improbable twist of fate, something went perfectly right. Lucky Lady wasn't just another tank to her crew. She was the reason they were still alive. Staff Sergeant Grady had commanded her through the hedgerows of Normandy, where she'd taken 2 direct hits and kept moving. Tom Barlow had been her gunner since the breakout at St. Lo, where Lucky Lady had knocked out a German Panzer IV at point-blank range in a village square, saving an entire infantry platoon. The driver, Private Eddie Kowalski, swore the tank had a sixth sense for avoiding mines. The loader, PFC Martinez, had carved notches into the interior for every engagement they'd survived. 11 marks. Each one a day they'd cheated death together. In a war where Sherman crews measured their life expectancy in weeks, Lucky Lady had kept them breathing for 5 months. That wasn't luck. That was survival, forged in fire and fear. But now, standing in the cold rain watching mechanics shake their heads over her mangled turret, the crew faced a grim reality. "The gun mount's destroyed," the chief mechanic had declared. "Recoil cylinders leaking. Turret rings jammed. She needs a full rebuild we don't have time or parts for." Grady had argued. Barlow had pleaded. But the answer remained the same until Hartfield got the assignment, more out of desperation than confidence. Now alone with the damaged Sherman, Sammy understood why the others had refused. The gun's misalignment was catastrophic. The mounting brackets had been wrenched nearly 2 degrees off-center by the near miss that had punched through the turret. The recoil cylinder showed stress fractures. Worst of all, he was expected to recalibrate everything to factory specifications with tools better suited for rough engine work. He opened the technical manual, its pages already damp from the humidity, and tried to focus on the diagrams. The 75mm gun mount was a precision instrument, designed to absorb recoil while maintaining aim through a complex system of springs, hydraulic dampers, and stabilizing brackets. But there was a known flaw that every Sherman crew complained about. Tiny vibrations in the mount, microscopic shifts in the recoil cylinder pressure that caused rounds to drift at long range. The manual acknowledged it, but offered no solution beyond maintain factory tolerances. Sammy's hands shook as he positioned his bent ruler against the mounting bracket. The measurements had to be exact, but exhaustion blurred his vision and the flickering lantern played tricks with the shadows. Then the wind hit. A sudden gust tore through the workshop, and the lantern toppled, its flame extinguishing with a hiss. Tools clattered across the metal deck. In the near total darkness, broken only by distant lightning, Sammy Hartfield reached for the adjustment bolt and began to tighten, working entirely by feel, instinct, and desperation. He had no idea he was about to create a miracle. In the darkness, Sammy Hartfield worked like a man possessed. His fingers found the stabilizer bolts by memory and desperation. Without light to guide him, he relied on the texture of metal, the resistance of threads, the subtle give of components under tension. The bent ruler lay useless beside him, its distorted markings meaningless now. So he improvised measurements using finger widths and the span of his palm, methods no army manual would ever approve. Rain hammered the canvas overhead in rhythmic waves. Lightning occasionally illuminated the workshop in stark white flashes, throwing elongated shadows across Lucky Lady's damaged turret before plunging everything back into blackness. Sammy's breath misted in the cold November air as he tightened one bracket, then another, his hands moving with a certainty born of pure instinct rather than knowledge. He didn't realize what he was doing. The stabilizer bolts, meant to be torqued evenly to distribute stress across the gun mount, went in unevenly under his improvised technique. The left bracket received more tension than the right. The upper mount compressed slightly more than the lower. By every engineering standard, it was wrong. But in his fumbling, Sammy had accidentally introduced a counterbalance, a precise asymmetry that neutralized the micro-vibrations that plagued every Sherman's long-range accuracy. When he moved to the recoil cylinder, exhaustion made his movements sluggish. He adjusted the pressure valve, trying to remember the manual's specifications, but unable to see the gauge in the darkness. He turned it too far, then backed it off, then forward again, settling on a pressure that felt right, even though it violated factory norms. What he didn't know was that his wrong setting perfectly compensated for the design flaw that caused rounds to drift at distance. By the time the first gray light of dawn crept through gaps in the canvas, Sammy had finished. He slumped against Lucky Lady's hull, wiping rain and sweat from his face with a grimy sleeve. His hands ached. His eyes burned. And in the pit of his stomach sat a gnawing certainty that he'd botched the entire repair. That when the crew test fired the gun, it would blow apart or miss by yards. He had no way of knowing the truth. In his exhausted, improvised, by the seat of his pants repair work, he had just created the most accurate Sherman tank gun ever fielded in World War II. As the camp began to stir with the morning, Lucky Lady sat silent beneath her torn canvas shelter, an ordinary-looking tank harboring an extraordinary secret that no one, not even her mechanic, yet understood. Lucky Lady rumbled back into combat 2 days later, her crew silent with doubt. Barlow had test-fired the gun that morning at a nearby hillside, and something felt off. Not catastrophically wrong, but different. The recoil seemed softer. The turret traversed with an unusual smoothness. Grady noticed it too, but said nothing. They'd requested a proper mechanic to double-check Hartfield's work. But with the push toward the Siegfried line intensifying, no one had time for inspections. Now, positioned on a ridgeline outside Metz, with morning fog still clinging to the valleys, they had bigger problems. "Panthers," Kowalski whispered from the driver's seat, his voice tight. "Jesus, Sarge, 3 of them. Maybe 1,800 yards out." Grady raised his binoculars. Through the mist, He could make out the distinctive sloped hulls of German Panther tanks moving along a distant tree line. Sleek, lethal predators, equipped with high-velocity 75mm guns that could punch through a Sherman's armor at ranges where American tanks couldn't effectively return fire. "We're pulling back," Barlow said immediately, his hand hovering over the gun controls. "Sarge, at that range, we might as well throw rocks. We can't touch them." It was tactical gospel. Sherman crews avoided long-range duels with Panthers the way infantrymen avoided open fields. The math was brutal and simple. German guns outranged American guns, and engaging meant death. But something in Grady's gut said otherwise. Maybe it was desperation. Maybe it was faith in Lucky Lady's track record. Maybe it was just stubborn refusal to retreat again. "Load he ordered quietly. "Sarge." "One round, Barlow, just to make them nervous. Then we displace." Martinez, the loader, slammed a high-explosive shell into the breach with practiced efficiency. Barlow sighted through the periscope, calculating windage and elevation for a shot he didn't believe would come close. His hand trembled slightly on the firing trigger. "On the way," he muttered, and squeezed. The 75mm gun roared. For a moment the crew held their breath, expecting to see the round fall short by hundreds of yards, a futile gesture before retreat. But the shell streaked across the impossible distance like a lance thrown by an angry god, and detonated not beside the lead Panther, not near it, but virtually on top of its hull, showering the German tank with dirt and shrapnel. Dead silence filled Lucky Lady's cramped interior. That can't be right," Barlow whispered. Grady's jaw clenched. His eyes locked on the distant Panthers, which had frozen in apparent confusion. "Load AP," he said, his voice suddenly sharp with adrenaline. "Now!" The armor-piercing round slammed into the lead Panther's turret with a sound like a hammer striking an anvil. At nearly 1,900 yards, a distance where most Sherman gunners wouldn't even attempt a shot, Barlow's AP round punched through the Panther's side armor. Smoke began pouring from the German tank's hatches. The crew bailed out, sprinting for cover as their vehicle burned. "Holy Mother of God," Martinez breathed, frozen mid-reload. But there was no time to process the impossible. The second Panther was traversing its gun toward them, and the third was maneuvering for a better angle. Grady's training overrode his shock. "Second target! Load! Load!" Barlow adjusted his sight, hands moving with mechanical precision even as his mind reeled. The second Panther was angling away, presenting a difficult deflection shot at nearly 2 kilometers. He led the target, compensated for drop, and fired. The round caught the Panther's turret in a glancing blow. Not a penetrating hit, but the impact was so precise it jammed the German tank's turret ring. The Panther stopped, helpless, its gun frozen, mid-traverse. Inside Lucky Lady, the crew operated in stunned silence, punctuated only by the rhythmic clanging of shells being loaded. Around them, other American tanks had stopped to watch, their commanders standing in open hatches with binoculars, witnessing something that defied everything they knew about armored warfare. The third Panther, now desperate, began reversing into the tree line. Barlow tracked it smoothly, waited for a clear shot, and fired again. The AP round crossed nearly 2,000 yards in a flat trajectory and struck the Panther's turret ring, the most vulnerable junction between turret and hull. The German tank shuddered, its turret locking in place, and then it too began retreating in a cloud of smoke and panic. Over the open radio net, intercepted German communications crackled with confusion. "Was ist das? Amerikanischer Prototyp? Das ist unmöglich." What is that? American prototype? That's impossible. From the American tanks witnessing the engagement, voices exploded in disbelief. That's no goddamn Sherman. What the hell are they firing? Did you see that? Did you see that? Within hours, Lucky Lady's impossible shots would become legend across the front lines, whispered about in foxholes, debated in command posts, and scribbled frantically into after-action reports that officers would later struggle to believe. But inside the tank, as the crew sat in the ringing silence after the engagement, Grady and Barlow exchanged a look of pure, unfiltered fear, mixed with awe. "Sarge," Barlow said quietly, his voice shaking, "this tank ain't supposed to shoot like that." Grady had no answer, because Barlow was absolutely right, and that terrified him more than any German tank ever had. The reports reached German intelligence within 48 hours. Intercepted communications painted an alarming picture: an American Sherman tank demonstrating unnaturally precise long-range fire, hitting targets at distances previously thought impossible for the M4 platform. Analysts in Berlin pored over the fragmentary accounts, theorizing about new optical systems, gyroscopic stabilizers, or perhaps a prototype fire control computer the Americans had managed to miniaturize. Whatever it was, it represented a potential shift in the armored balance that couldn't be ignored. The panic wasn't limited to one side of the front. Within the American command structure, Lucky Lady's performance triggered a different kind of alarm. 3 days after the Panther engagement, Grady and his crew found themselves standing at attention in a forward command post, facing a semicircle of skeptical officers and tight-lipped engineers. "Walk me through it again," a colonel demanded, his tone suggesting he thought they were either lying or hallucinating. "You're telling me you scored 3 hits on moving Panther tanks at ranges exceeding 1,800 yards? "Yes, sir," Grady replied evenly. "Witnessed by 4 other tank crews." An ordnance captain shook his head. "Shermans don't shoot like that. The 75mm gun doesn't have that kind of precision at extended range. It's mechanically impossible." "With respect, sir," Barlow interjected quietly, "I was on the gun. I know what I hit." The interrogation continued for an hour, circling the same impossible facts. Finally, someone thought to ask about maintenance records. That's when Corporal Hartfield was summoned. Sammy stood before the assembled officers, mud still caked on his boots, looking like he wanted to disappear into the floorboards. When asked to describe his repair work on Lucky Lady's gun mount, he stumbled through an explanation of that rain-soaked night. The broken tools, the failed lantern, the adjustments made by feel in near-total darkness. With each detail, the officers' expressions grew more troubled. Concerned glances passed between them. An engineer scribbled furious notes, underlining certain phrases multiple times. "You adjusted the stabilizer bolts unevenly?" the ordnance captain asked slowly. I tried to get them right, sir, but the light and the recoil cylinder pressure?" Sammy's face flushed. "I couldn't see the gauge properly. I just went by feel." The room fell silent. Every regulation, every training manual, every principle of military standardization screamed that what Hartfield described should have resulted in a dangerously malformed weapon, not a miracle of precision. The door opened, and a major with Ordnance Corps insignia stepped inside. His expression was granite. "Major Whitford," he announced curtly, "I'm here to inspect this tank personally." Major Whitford conducted his investigation with the cold efficiency of a man hunting for failure, not genius. He interviewed each crew member separately, taking meticulous notes and asking the same questions from different angles, searching for inconsistencies or exaggerations. When he questioned Sammy, his tone carried the unmistakable edge of a superior officer, confronting incompetence rather than exploring innovation. So you admit, Whitford said slowly, that you performed critical gun calibration work without proper lighting, without functional measuring instruments, and without following established technical procedures? Sir, I was ordered to make the repair. I did the best I could under the circumstances. The best you could? Whitford's jaw tightened. Corporal, do you understand that unauthorized modifications to weapon systems can result in catastrophic failure? Men's lives depend on these machines functioning exactly as designed. The next morning, Whitford ordered a demonstration. Under the watchful eyes of 3 ordnance engineers, Sammy was instructed to recreate his repair process on Lucky Lady's gun mount while they observed. With shaking hands, Sammy showed them how he'd adjusted the stabilizer bolts in the darkness, tightening them unevenly because he couldn't see the alignment marks. He explained how he'd set the recoil cylinder pressure by feel, unable to read the gauge. He described using his palm width to measure bracket spacing when his ruler proved useless. The engineers' faces progressed from skepticism to horror. "This is completely outside specification," one muttered, scribbling rapid calculations. "The asymmetric bolt tension alone should cause harmonic vibrations that—" "It's unsafe," another interrupted flatly. "Even if it worked once, there's no way to replicate these settings reliably. Every tank would need custom calibration. It's operationally impossible." Whitford listened to their assessments with his arms crossed, his expression hardening with each technical condemnation. When they finished, he turned to Sammy with something approaching contempt. "Corporal Hartfield, your improvisation may have accidentally produced favorable results, but it represents everything wrong with field maintenance. Weapon systems must be standardized, predictable, and safe. What you've created is none of those things." He turned to the senior engineer. "Strip the gun mount. Rebuild it to factory specification. No exceptions. I want this tank returned to standard configuration within 24 hours. Sammy felt something break inside his chest. "Sir, but it works. It works better than—" "That will be all, Corporal." For the rest of that day, Sammy stood at a distance, watching army mechanics dismantle his accidental masterpiece bolt by bolt. They measured precisely, consulted manuals, and restored everything to exact factory tolerances, methodically erasing the miracle he'd created in darkness and desperation. By evening, Lucky Lady's gun mount looked perfect by every technical standard, and the greatest Sherman tank gun ever fielded no longer existed. The test was scheduled for dawn, under Major Whitford's direct supervision. A derelict German half-track was positioned on a hillside at 1,600 yards, well within the range where Lucky Lady had performed her miracles. Grady's crew manned their stations in tense silence, each man harboring a desperate hope that somehow the factory rebuild wouldn't matter, that Lucky Lady would still shoot true. Barlow sighted carefully, compensating for distance and wind exactly as he had 3 days earlier. His hand rested on the firing mechanism, and for a moment, he allowed himself to believe. "On the way," he whispered, and fired. The round sailed downrange and impacted 50 yards short and 20 yards left of the target. No one spoke. Martinez loaded another round with mechanical precision, his face blank. The second shot flew long, overshooting the half-track by 30 yards and kicking up dirt on the hillside beyond. Barlow adjusted again, his movements growing more frantic. The third round veered right, missing the target by an even wider margin than the first two. The silence inside Lucky Lady was suffocating. Major Whitford, observing through binoculars from a command vehicle, lowered them slowly and made a note on his clipboard. Around the test range, the assembled officers and engineers nodded to each other with grim satisfaction. Proof that the miracle had been nothing more than statistical anomaly or battlefield confusion. But the men who'd witnessed Lucky Lady's impossible shots knew better. Standing apart from the official observers, Sammy Hartfield watched the missed rounds with tears burning behind his eyes. His hands clenched into fists at his sides as the realization crashed over him like a physical weight. They killed it. They killed what I made. Inside the tank, Grady placed a hand on Barlow's shoulder. The gunner sat frozen, staring through the periscope at the untouched target in the distance. Martinez and Kowalski exchanged hollow glances. They'd all felt it. The subtle difference in the recoil, the slight vibration that hadn't been there before, the return of the micro shudder that Sammy's mistake had somehow eliminated. Lucky Lady had lost her gift, stripped away by order and regulation. 2 days later, Corporal Hartfield received new orders. He was reassigned to a motor pool 60 miles behind the lines, an administrative exile dressed up as routine personnel rotation. No explanation was given, no questions were entertained. Lucky Lady returned to combat as an ordinary Sherman, performing adequately, but unremarkably. Her crew fought bravely through the final months of the war, but they never again experienced that brief, shining moment when their tank had been something more. The war moved on. Commanders forgot. Reports were filed and buried, and the miracle became just another rumor, whispered in foxholes and dismissed in daylight. 63 years later, in a climate-controlled room deep within the National Archives in Washington, D.C., a historian named Dr. Eleanor Chen opened a misfiled box labeled simply Ordnance Meisk, 1944. She'd been researching Sherman tank modifications for a doctoral thesis, working through thousands of documents that chronicled the mundane details of wartime maintenance and repair. Most boxes yielded nothing but requisition forms and inspection reports. She expected this one to be the same. Beneath a stack of routine maintenance logs, her fingers found a single sheet of paper, its edges yellowed with age, covered in shaky handwriting that looked like it had been written in haste or distress. The note was dated December 1944 and signed by a Captain Morris, Ordnance Corps. Dr. Chen began reading, and her breath caught. Regarding Incident Report 447G, Sherman M4A3, designation Lucky Lady. After extensive review, we have determined the extraordinary accuracy demonstrated was not the result of equipment upgrade or battlefield exaggeration. Corporal S. Hartfield's unauthorized repair work accidentally compensated for inherent vibration in the gun mount stabilizer, a known defect we have been unable to resolve through conventional engineering. His improvised calibration, performed under non-standard conditions, achieved what our entire Ordnance Division has failed to replicate in controlled environments. Major Whitford's decision to restore factory specifications was procedurally correct, but eliminated the only documented solution to the Sherman's long-range accuracy problem. We cannot reverse this decision without admitting institutional failure. Recommend case be classified and removed from active files. It wasn't an upgrade, it was his mistake, and we erased it. Dr. Chen read the note 3 times, her hands trembling. The document confirmed everything. A young mechanic's desperate improvisation had solved a design flaw that trained engineers couldn't fix. The Army, faced with an inconvenient miracle that challenged their expertise and couldn't be mass-produced, had chosen bureaucratic erasure over innovation. She immediately began searching for more information, cross-referencing unit records, tracking down after-action reports, hunting for any surviving witnesses. Most trails were cold. Sammy Hartfield had died in 1987, never knowing his mistake had been vindicated. The crew of Lucky Lady had scattered to the winds of history. But the truth, once buried, was now undeniable. For one impossible day in November 1944, An ordinary Sherman tank had become the deadliest precision weapon on the Western Front. Not through military genius or technological breakthrough, but through the exhausted improvisation of a young corporal working in darkness and rain. Innovation, it turned out, could come from anywhere. Even from a grease-stained mechanic in a ruined workshop who didn't know what he'd created until it was taken away. History nearly forgot the miracle. But the truth waited, patient and silent, in the quiet of an archive box, for someone to finally open it.